Welcome to FO Talks. With me is David Mahon from Beijing. He's my favorite China analyst. He publishes regularly with us, is very generous with his time in speaking with us. And today we are going to discuss the Donald Trump Xi Jinping Beijing summit. There has been a big summit, lots of declarations, lots of commentary, actually non-stop commentary. David, what do you make of all of this?
The trip was positive in that it went smoothly, and given the unpredictability of Donald Trump, nothing really happened that would have been considered uncontained or ungoverned, which is very unusual. So it denoted a number of things, and one of them is that America's sense of itself with China has changed, and also China's sense of its own place in the world has also changed. So they met as the two key, one could say great powers, using a 19th century term, in a way that really we would probably say they met as equals to some extent, which has never really been the case before. China has always been, to some degree, the junior when it came to power and economy. So it was interesting on many levels, but that was one general takeaway.
I see. So let me read you what the Council on Foreign Relations published. And according to the CFR, which is the American establishment, the summit had mutually useful ambiguity. And the piece on CFR contrasted the White House fact sheet and the interpretation of the summit from the White House fact sheet with the comments from the Chinese Commerce Ministry and other sources, and said that both sides, whilst they may claim, and this is what I read from the White House fact sheet, constructive relationship of strategic stability on the basis of fairness and reciprocity. What this actually means is construed very differently in both these countries. Would you agree?
I would, but I would say any meeting between heads of state, the Chinese version of what has been discussed and agreed, and in this case, the visiting delegation's version, while they work off what was discussed and agreed, they invariably interpret it differently.
All right, so let me read to you what the White House fact sheet says. It's titled, Donald Trump Secures Historic Deals with China, Delivering for American Workers, Farmers, and Industry. It goes on to trumpet agreements. China agrees that Iran should not be nuclear. In fact, they make a big deal out of this. They say that the Strait of Hormuz should be open. No country or organization can be allowed to charge tolls. So US and China agree that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. The Strait of Hormuz will be open. And also, they confirmed their shared goal to denuclearize North Korea. Now, that is one. There's also talk of establishing US-China boards of trade and investment. The Board of Trade will allow the US government and government of China to manage bilateral trade across non-sensitive goods, whatever those non-sensitive goods mean. The Board of Investment will provide government-to-government forum for discussing investment-related issues. The White House fact sheet also points out to the fact that US and China will address US concerns relating to rare earths and other critical minerals. China will purchase 200 American-made Boeing aircraft. China will purchase $17 billion worth of agricultural goods. Obviously, these will be in addition to soybean purchase commitments in October 2025. China has restored market access for US beef, and China resumes or will resume imports of poultry from the US. And all of that, is a very transactional record of what the US has managed to achieve. Educate us as to the Chinese perception of the summit. Because I have a feeling the Chinese didn't go through line item by line item as the White House fact sheet did.
First, let's go to a principle in Washington, and that is that there is probably the only joint aim between Democrats and Republicans, and this is going back to Bill Clinton. China must be contained. It needs to remain weaker than America militarily and geopolitically. It's a fundamental principle, which it's not just some American vanity. Any great power, if Britain was still running the world, God help us, then it would also be a principle of foreign policy in London. That's normal.
That's any great powers. Any top dog doesn't want to challenge it. That's just almost the law of nature.
So all this talk of agreement, these boards of trade and investment, in a meeting between any top leader with China, Xi Jinping, they will discuss things in principle. China is the master of the memorandum of understanding, the letter of intent. I reviewed one yesterday, quite a substantial one, where there's a sovereign and investment kind of Belt and Road deal. And it's very good. It's full of details. It doesn't bind either party to anything. It lays out the joint aspirations, to some degree acknowledges some concerns, but it is a very clear platform, background for cooperation. That is all America achieved. The Boeing sales were talked about. There's a tremendous amount of negotiation before you end up seeing a contract with any number of aircraft where China's got a schedule, and you know that between now and whatever year they'll take X number of aircraft. As far as agricultural products go,
by the way, Boeing shares actually went down because, or some number to that effect.
Well, Donald Trump said there was 750 planes to be purchased, and then announced 200. So in that weirdness, some aspects of capital markets are the sort of the static of an economy rather than the true plumbing of what an economy is doing and how it is evolving. So I take those movements with a grain of salt, but it is interesting. I think maybe at the back of that, there is some sense of reality of those that understand what such huge purchases entail. And then you go to agricultural products. China has already diversified away from the US in sourcing particularly soybeans. It buys from a number of countries, but we'll take Brazil as one of the examples. Brazilian beans are less expensive, and they are of higher nutritional quality per ton, per kilo, than American soybeans. The American advantage has always been, as with so many American companies, the efficiency of contracts, the integrity behind the contracts. American companies, unlike the government, have a very good track record of sticking to deals and transactions, particularly in relation to China. So buying soybeans from America's Midwest, Chinese purchasers really were looking at that stability, looking at that predictability and reliability over the years. Now it's switched away to Brazil. Things have really gone well, actually. Brazil stepped up. The volumes are very high. I don't see China now betraying those that came in and adjusted to China's requirements when, because of the geopolitics, sourcing from the US was no longer in China's interest. So I take it with somewhat of a grain of salt. I think that there will be some agricultural trade. I think animal feed is an interesting area. people perhaps don't think of it as being so important, but something as simple as alfalfa coming out of the state of Washington, Oregon in the season means that Chinese farms, feedlot farms, can feed their animals more efficiently than sourcing from China's northeast. And that was a really important part of the agricultural system. If China is going to be focused on what it needs, it's likely to look at something where there is still a need. China's improved its own domestic feed supply, but again, these are easy contract and there's a considerable quality that America can provide. I also would hope that dairy products comes back in. They're heavily tariffed. Ingredients carry a tariff of, I think, 10, 15%. And China needs skim milk powder. China needs sweet whey powder for human consumption. This America has in abundance, and China's other dairy suppliers don't have the same. So there are things which are in China's interest, and I think with those they'll try and do deals. For the rest of it, we have to be, I think, very, I would say, healthily skeptical, because a lot is always said at these summits, but I don't think the preparation behind the Trump delegation was to any depth that they could have come and then come away with things that are signed or things that are developed commercially. It was almost done on the fly. So, in essence, it will differ because I don't think the Chinese will acknowledge they have made the commitments the White House is talking about.
It's funny. I mean, I read somewhere that the Commerce Ministry, the Chinese Commerce Ministry, and here I have it in my notes, did not provide timelines, values, or volumes. So, to your point, a lot of these declarations on the part of the US are aspirational. Now, you mentioned something very important. You mentioned that the summit for China was not so transactional as almost perceptional. Now, thanks to this summit, China has established itself as a near peer, if not exactly a peer, in this summit. And the Chinese language press reportedly has covered that China, or rather the US, is willing to respect China's core interests in the interests of stability. And one of them is Taiwan. In fact, Xi Jinping, if I have it right, said Taiwan is the most important issue in US China relations. So expand a little bit further here, David.
Taiwan is important in the US-China relations because the US has used Taiwan in its toolkit of China containment. It's always been a qualifying factor. When Richard Nixon came in 1972, during his discussions with Mao, one of the cornerstones was that the acknowledgement that China's claim to Taiwan was valid, it would not be challenged by the US, that peaceful reunification was a major objective that both he and Mao shared and recognized, which if you look at even in the 70s, it was still close enough to the revolution for it to be fair to say, well, a civil war was interrupted by the Korean War, making Taiwan useful strategically to the US. And so its support deepened, which delayed what may have been a return of Taiwan to the mainland of China. Now, one can argue whether that was possible at the time, but that was the direction anyway. And to take that as a position, I think, is fair on the part of Beijing. And it's important that whether one agrees with it or not, we acknowledge that is Beijing's thinking. So for the American position, Taiwan became a military platform during the Cold War and took on all sorts of strategic values to the US position when it was effectively the hegemon in Asia. Post that, we are given the view that most American political thinking is we're caring for a democracy, this is part of the American mojo, that it's to look after democracy, to promote democracy. And I think for some years that was true in the thinking of many policymakers and leaders in Washington. But for some time now, Taiwan has become irrelevant to real American interests, other than its leverage in its struggle with China. So it's almost cynical. And Nancy Pelosi's visit a few years ago demonstrated the cynicism of the attitude towards Taiwan. How do we needle China? We wind up Taiwan in some way, or we meet someone that from a protocol and diplomatic position, technically we shouldn't meet, because everyone who deals with China commercially has agreed to the one China policy. It's fundamental to diplomatic recognition. So it was mentioned. And I was surprised, because when I heard it was going to be mentioned, I was a little concerned, because I thought, well, why would China make an issue of it when it would be better for China to project the assumption that Taiwan is not a point of insecurity? They have already accepted one way or the other it's going to come back. Don't talk about it with America, because America really has no means to change that or derail that. And the military means to do so, while I think still exist, of course, within the American arsenal, the political and strategic manner in which America applies its military might calls into question whether it can or it would defend Taiwan. Ask the Vietnamese, ask the Afghans, ask the Syrians, ask the Libyans, whose struggle was interrupted by bombing led by the US, and the country left into chaos, which it still is. So China's not so concerned on that front. And I thought, but it was interesting. I think this is China perceiving the uncertainty in the president that attacked Iran so recently. And it seems from all military analysis, this is a war America has already lost. So Xi might have thought, let's bring up Taiwan and let's reinforce the fact that we can see you're not going to stand by the island. And if America backs off militarily, if America were to offer some kind of concession on the basis that reunification would be peaceful, any idea of invasion or coercion militarily on the part of China would actually decline rather than increase. So it was a very interesting point raised. I'm not sure if we know what the ramifications of it are yet, but I think it was more a Xi Jinping taking advantage of what he saw a moment of strategic weakness in the American position globally, and Trump responded to it. He basically said, yeah, we're not going to mess with this. And that's the first time an American president's indicated anything like that. So that was very interesting.
Well, two quick things here. China has become increasingly more aggressive against Taiwan. The end of the year, they had a big military exercise. And Japan has now started supporting Taiwan, and there's controversy over Japanese missiles in Yonaguni Island. As you know, retired CIA officer Glenn Carl, who's a senior partner at FOI, and I did a long podcast on Taiwan, and I wrote a big piece on China-Japan tensions. So it is something we've been following closely and with some concern. And my question to you is, quite simply, does China now think it can make a move on Taiwan, tighten the screws, not necessarily military conquest, but just make any move towards independence more unpalatable?
China could take Taiwan tomorrow. The cost would be immense, it'd be incredibly high. The death toll would be huge on the civilian population of Taiwan, and the Chinese military, as any invading force as opposed to a defending force, would also suffer considerable losses. China has at no stage in recent years.
our viewers should understand that Taiwan is not a flat island. The terrain is particularly suited for a war of attrition and a war in which casualties will be really high. Over to you, David.
It's a very good point. And also, the Strait of Taiwan is not the English Channel. It's huge. And to cross that strait is a massive challenge. So amphibious landings, a bit rough. But China has not intended to attack Taiwan at any stage in my 41 years in Beijing. When you look at the position, China has been watching itself basically encircled by American, especially to its maritime east and south, by American military to an extraordinary degree. The concentrations are huge. America has positioned itself militarily as one would that is about to actually engage in war. The interesting thing is the THAAD missiles moved out of Korea and the Patriot systems moved to actually support the invasion of Iran, or the attack on Iran, has alleviated some of those tensions. So when you talk about China's aggression, China has been responding in its investment in its military to the fact that America has been sitting at the fringes of its territorial waters. And also, let's remember, every year, America leads war games, some of the largest military exercises since the Vietnam War, in rehearsal to fight China. And its partners are countries like France, that people forget, has in the Pacific and lesser degree in the Indian Ocean, the remnants of an empire. And it is very jealous of the empire. Ask the poor Kanaks on New Caledonia. And so there is this participation underpinned by Philippine insecurity, New Zealand and Australian vanity, that they are still Western countries of note, so should join in, don't want to be left out. Or at the same time, expect to have preferential trade relations with China. So all this is going on, and China demonstrates it has some missiles, or it sails its navy around. I mean, China is doing very little in terms of escalation. And again, there was a discussion, and I've heard two versions, and I don't know which is true, but Obama was asked by Xi when they first met, why don't we have a non-militarized South China Sea? And I was told Obama refused. I've heard from the other side that it was Xi that refused. But in the end, some kind of deal, regardless of what happens to the continued contraction of the American empire, it'll still be a great power. It'll still be a mighty military power. There needs to be some deal. So the stupidity of Japan, and I say that with someone with deep respect for Japan. I love its culture. I've had nothing but good experiences in traveling to Japan. It's America does that thing the schoolyard bully does. It pushes people out to sort of struggle and punch others. And so stupidly, it's engaged Australia in a massive military build-up, which relates more to having an extension of the US's military presence for Australian purposes. And by this way, I'm not saying that I think Australia shouldn't have a great military. And I also don't believe that AUKUS is the big deal that I used to believe. It's about 2% of Australian spending on military if you take it from now until 2040. So the submarine thing, yeah, Australia needs submarines you can't hear and you can't find. That's okay. But overall, it is really positioning itself as a sort of an outrigger to American military power. So all this is going on, and there's Japan stating something that doesn't need to be said, that we would support Taiwan if attacked by China. I mean, okay, how will that work? And is Taiwan under attack? This is Takaichi looking for domestic votes. At the time when she became prime minister, she lacked both houses. She's got them. Very clever politician. This was to domestic consumption. So of course China responds, because these are the equivalent of Hawaiians waking up each day wondering if those ships they can see on the horizon might shoot them year in, year out. That's the American position against China in a maritime way. Or for China to start garrisoning Cuba or a couple of the independent Caribbean islands. So this is a sort of push back and forth. I do think China overdoes it. I think if they demonstrated less might, they would project more power. And I think at times it's out of their own, it has been historically out of their own strategic insecurity that the noises are so loud. But in the end, if we look at it, it's not an aggressive China. Why doesn't America back off trying to contain China? It's like the Third Reich sitting on the borders of Poland or Czechoslovakia for decades. That's how weird it is. Just back off. You know, don't show and boast that you've basically contained a country militarily. And the other part of it is that, and this is why I think there's never really been a ceasefire in this Persian Gulf War that we've experienced this year, because if you are blockading anything, you're engaged in an act of war. And China is effectively blockaded by embargoes, tariffs, and sanctions. So there is a state of trade war and there is a military preparedness that is insane. And until that changes, what anyone does in the region, basically, you can look at it in that framework. But I would say gradually people will stop doing America's bidding and there'll be less and less of these sort of statements that we're getting from Japan. So I do think things will settle down, not because of a choice by the United States, but by the natural pragmatism of Asian nations in the region.
So you do not worry too much about Chinese rhetoric and indeed Chinese military actions against Taiwan?
No, I would say quite clearly here, China is not going to invade Taiwan in 2027, as the Pentagon, the commentariat in Washington have pounded as some forecast that Xi put out. He never said that. It was mused upon that there was I think it's the 100 years of the People's Liberation Army, and it was one of the generals that made a reference to Taiwan. If China is watching what Russia tried to do in Ukraine, and what does Russia have, 350 square miles or kilometers? You know, it's not much for 4 years of war. It's observing what Israel has been trying to do to Lebanon, what it's been trying to do to Syria. Is it successful? And the US comes in. So China knows the odds of ending up in some ghastly protracted conflict that cuts it off from all that it needs of supply globally, its involvement in the global financial system. Why invade Taiwan? Taiwan's not going anywhere. Independence is a existential wish. Taiwan has its own form of sovereignty as an island. It has its own system, which is a way of defining one's sovereignty. It's got its legal system. It's got a remarkably sophisticated infrastructure in all those civil areas. It's a marvelous place. But Taiwan's independence is not Taiwan's choice. You declare independence and it is recognized. So if all the European countries, most of the Americas, etc., altogether said, yeah, we recognize your independence, that is Taiwanese independence. Just saying so doesn't do it. So it's really a political and diplomatic event that will define what's America going to do. Hook up Taiwan and row it south? You know, this whole thing is the emotional, cultural, the fear, the sort of bloodlust. There's so much wound into the way people think about this. And here we are. I look at, again, I arrived in Hong Kong in 1983 on my way to China. And I've heard almost like the rhythm of a heartbeat every election. every by-election, every election of local councillors, there is a statement about Taiwan being independent, and China reacts. And it goes on back and forth. And this counterpoint has come to nothing. I would love to meet those journalists who said, and they bet me expensive bottles of Bordeaux in the 90s that invasion was imminent. I'd love to find them today because it never happened. And I think we're in the
Did
same
you get your
situation
Bordeaux?
here. Well, I
Did
haven't
you get
yet.
your Bordeaux?
I got that's true. I did ultimately, but so let's look at interest here. What is the
Yeah.
interest of these countries? And Taiwanese are very practical people. I mean, I was on a phone to a leading businessman in Taipei as Nancy Pelosi was driving in from the airport, and he said there was no one's fussed, no one's interested. They get on with their lives. So, yeah, let's not overplay the Taiwan issue.
So let's talk about Chimerica. This is a portmanteau uh, of China and America. A lecturer I knew, and I know, though not very well, from my Oxford days is Neil Ferguson. He
Yeah.
and Moritz Schularik came up with this word: Chinese savers and American borrowers, Chinese producers and American consumers. They are bound together, and this is what drives the global economy. G2, one may say. Now that model is under threat, it might be fair to say that China wants managed competition, America wants managed trade. Donald Trump knows that shutting off Chinese goods means inflation soars, means people cannot buy stuff from Walmart or Amazon, and the Republicans lose handsomely in the elections. China knows that the US is still powerful enough to block the Strait of Hormuz, no, actually, Strait of Malacca. Strait of Hormuz, the Iranians have proved that they could block with drones and speedboats and not very expensive tech. And the Malacca Dilemma is something ex President Hu Jintao talked about. So China does not want its entire economic miracle to come under the threat of war. So, in a nutshell, how does this increasing tension play out, and how does this mutual dependency unravel, or for that matter, evolve going forward?
The relationship commercially between China and America, if you take the real engagement commercially, which really started to occur at the end of the 80s, it got momentum in the 90s. So Chinese reform is going on domestically. There's tremendous change. We all know that story. And the American economy becomes more deeply interconnected with the Chinese economy, also delivering tremendous wealth to America. One of the genius parts of that is instead of, I had one client based in Columbus, Ohio, and they made gas bottles, very practical and it wasn't the most advanced technology. It worked very well. They made good money. They were reliable. But it really wasn't practical for that company to go and making that product there. It would be better they bought it from China and made something else that in the end China wouldn't compete with. And the whole story of the China-US relationship was a transfer, not of China stealing jobs. China didn't march into America, pick up factories, and leave people unemployed. American businesses, for economic reasons, moved to China as they were moving around the globe since 1925. So it was a great partnership.
Sorry to interrupt. There's a paper called The China Shock that has proved to be incredibly influential in the US. I sit here in Washington, you're sitting in Beijing. And here in the US, there is a feeling very strong, particularly amongst a lot of businesses and amongst the working class, that China hollowed out the good, decent, well paying working class jobs and left middle America a shell. And yes, American shareholders benefited, because labor costs went down. And yes, American consumers benefited because they could buy cheap stuff, but the American workers paid the price. Over to you, David.
It's a falsehood, and it's one that is shameful, because in America you have some extraordinary sources of more balanced narrative in assessment. I think it's Harvard, Johns Hopkins. You can go to any of these, and they look at the change in industrial America. And I'm not getting this right, but the principles are probably, I know, are correct. It's a study over of 20 or so years. The loss of jobs is something like 70 million, of which 3 to 4 are directly related to China. The rest are related to technology and the movement elsewhere and NAFTA. So it is unbelievably, it's the sort of thing you say, this is the stuff Goebbels used, and America is better than this. America is far finer and more decent than this, because this is also race. This is to do with the Chinese. And what Americans benefited from in the Chinese market, General Motors is here, Coca-Cola is here, Johnson & Johnson is here. American brands, American paradigms of business and manufacturing have been a major part of what has facilitated and driven China's evolution to the huge benefit of American shareholders. So, in essence, that whole story is just not true. America made choices related to borrowing a lot of money. So each election cycle, whether they were Republicans or Democrats, they could deliver a lifestyle to Americans that actually was beyond the means of the country. And we don't need very complex economics. We don't need Professor Ferguson to help us with this one. And that is that when you are spending more than you earn, and you have the deficits that even, and as far as we know economic history, normally will collapse any empire, America's on another planet. It's already beyond the solar system. So this is just not true. It's a bit like Chinese debt levels. People say it's all over, it's going to collapse, etc. Most of Chinese debt is to itself. It's on its own government balance sheet. It's part of how cash and assets have been, or cash has been moved around for its development. So we need some hard reality here. And I think there are very good voices in the US if they were listened to. And I note, President Trump brought no diplomatic experience. Is it 115 embassies are without ambassadors out of the 182 that the US has globally because of the degrading of your foreign service? And on this delegation, there are also no sinologists. And there's some extraordinary thinkers in the US. You have on the center left, you have people like Adam Tooze, who's written extensively and accurately about China. You could bring in Rana Mitter from Oxford, or I think he's at Harvard at the moment, or Professor Jin from LSE. These are all big thinkers with extraordinary depth that talk about China. So it's just not true. These are the sort of petty fringes of consideration. The real story is that, yes, both countries had a very close relationship. If China and America could be as they were prior to Trump's first term, there would be no tariff barriers on either side. Things like rare earths would be flowing into the US, which would be hugely helpful on the tech front. Look at who he brought with him. They were the tech bros. The real forum now for consideration is this great technological revolution sweeping the globe. He didn't bring, it wasn't about nuclear weapons or military so much. The real struggle now has moved to a competition on technology. And that's why you saw the people with him. So, and in that, I think it's going to be a much more fruitful competition rather than some end game. I think both countries will lift each other's game and we'll all benefit as consumers. And what we depend upon in technology will become better quality and more affordable. So ultimately, out of that, it's going to be a good outcome. It's managing the interim. But the tensions won't come off I mean, Biden, a very bad president, a warmonger in my view. They could have ended the war in Ukraine if he'd put his mind to it. There was an agreement in Ankara or Istanbul at the end of the first year, vetoed by the US, agreed to by all parties, including the European Union. Using Ukraine as a proxy was very much in President Biden's mojo, and his combative language in terms of China. So I think we're in for a long run. Whoever is going to follow President Trump, in terms of America is defining its own internal issues, its loss of primacy as being China's taking it from them, when it is pulling it apart itself and looking for a scapegoat because it can't face what it's doing to itself.
So let me bring you back to the summit. Some people have said that the summit was G2 choreography, but there's no G2 architecture. And you've said the summit was good in terms of at least they talked to each other, there was no incident. But the bigger question is, does this summit lay some kind of foundation for the two countries to talk to each other and to manage their various tensions? Because let's face it, whilst in the long run we could all be optimistic and think that things will turn out all right, in the interim, if we look at the period before World War One, nobody wanted war and everyone drifted into war. And Neil Ferguson has talked about this being Cold War 2.2, something I don't agree with. I think we are living more in a pre-World War One period with lots of powers and lots of things facing risk of going awry than this concerted, clearly ideological Cold War after World War II. So can the US and China avoid the Thucydides trap?
First of all, the West has to take off its Western 500 years tinted with Greek vanity about whether continuation of Greece. Take those lenses off. They distort everything it looks at. What has this got to do with the European war in 1914, when it was still remnants of empires, principalities?
Those were empires in their heyday. They weren't remnants then. They were in their heyday, many empires. The British were in their heyday. The French were in their heyday. The Ottomans were declining, of course, and the Russians were declining. But certainly, the Western Europeans were in their heyday.
I stand corrected, Atul. A few remnants of something of the past, but the bulk of the driving behind it were major economic forces and military forces. So let's forget about Athens. Let's forget about World War One, and also let's forget about the Cold War, because it just doesn't work. It's the intellectual laziness, and Neil Ferguson is not intellectually indolent, but it's a kind of indolence. Let's find ways to define the age we're actually in, and find language to be accurate for it. Let's look at it from the perspective that this is an Asian phenomenon across the region. Whether we're sitting in Mumbai or whether we're sitting in Tokyo, there is something moving that is transforming the world. It is a return in some ways, and you can see that in history, that instead of 8% of the people of the world running most of the world for 300 and something years, it'll return to being close to 40% to 60%. But still, it'll be a massive bulk of people, which is a more natural place if you think of the way the world is structured, even taking into account the nuances and the exceptionalism of economics and political history. Asia is back. America is already out of Asia. China has won that through investment and through the relationships it shares, and frankly, all the way to Sydney. So it's over. I mean, there's nothing left for America to take home. All that can be left are the outriggers of power, which are these military installations, and it cannot use them. Well, we're seeing the way in which a great military power can be confronted and confounded by a far weaker power because of technology. So we're in a very different era. And the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the West, the West being Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, America, that's kind of what people define the West. That's something where, well, there was no economic relationship or independence. I mean, America didn't need to trade with the Soviet Union. And until the early 60s, the Soviet Union was doing pretty well itself. So the parallels are distracting. They're not spurious, but they're distracting. I think we also should consider that this is dangerous. I am not an optimist when it comes to the US-China relationship. Nothing in America's behavior post-World War II gives us any reason to think it will make good strategic choices and truly understand what it has characterized as its adversary. It got Korea wrong, it got Vietnam wrong, it even got Eastern Europe wrong. It betrayed all the countries that hoped that they would be liberated because of the claims of supporting democracy wherever it existed. As someone who understands your own culture deeply, what has America ever done for India? I'm not evoking Monty Python's skit here, because you could go through all the things. India has always been there to be used, but too cunning to allow itself to be used, which is another interesting story in itself. So we're going through a period where China and America are going to go on in this state of tension. And there's going to be the marginalizing of the global economy as a result, because they are the two engines of the global economy. But America is going to be the net loser, because already China has shown it can diversify trade. China has shown it can maintain real economic growth domestically. And America doesn't have 1.4 billion people. China can trade with itself because of its scale. China isn't in the process of rapprochement with India, offering, and it'll be slow, but ultimately a whole nother field of economic activity. And finally, the Straits of Malacca. I mean, do these people, can they read a map? Why would China choke the one major artery of its own supply?
No, the point is the US could do so. So China has to behave.
Well, that's why the rocks and reefs. Yes, but why would the US do that? It would do that to hurt China. Would it dare do that? I don't think the US can afford to do it, because the US would have to justify a massive naval deployment. It would have to risk, as we have learned, ships at sea. I mean, the 3-mile limit was the distance you fired a cannon. That's how it was decided. So a cannonball could only go 3 miles maximum, or a big gun on a ship. 12 miles was a more arbitrary decision. And then we got the 200-mile limit because aircraft, missiles, but it was more of an economic coverage. The current US Navy is many, many hundreds of kilometers away from even the entry of the Straits of Hormuz, because if it moves closer, it's vulnerable and its ships could be sunk. So would America go into some kind of engagement around the Strait of Malacca and risk all its naval assets to the extent that it would? China doesn't want to either. So I think at the moment it's a fantasy. I'm not saying it would never happen, but I just don't see it as being a real geopolitical choke point. It justifies naval buildup in the area and expenditure on aircraft carriers. You know, in some ways, aircraft carriers are vital platforms to project power, because you turn up in someone's port with all these cool aircraft on this deck. And another way, it's a bit like building Zeppelins to augment your Air Force in 1943. So, you know, America is not going to be, it needs this story to justify how it invests to some degree. But it really is not an issue, in my sense, in the contemporary dynamics of what we are looking at.
So you think both countries will be able to manage their tensions, and the summit is a good first step?
I don't think they'll manage their tensions. I think the summit will be forgotten in the next 3 to 4 years. It is not one of the consequential summits of history. Very little was agreed. Mm-hmm. Nothing like the extraordinary meeting between Mao Zedong and Richard Nixon. But it's important, and we have to look at the nuances as we are. But until America acknowledges globally that it struggled to maintain global primacy, even its relationship in Europe, even its dynamic with Russia has changed. Don't fight to claw back what has changed around you. Consolidate what you are today, which is a very powerful country with extraordinary institutions, most of which Asian countries have tried to replicate because they are so good, and have that integrity that I recall as in my maturity trying to study and understand the world America stood for. It doesn't stand for that today. It stands for a rogue nation engaged in piracy, engaged in the kind of tactics that gangsters inflict upon their opponents or the sort of passive populations they rule. That's how America is perceived, not by China. You could go to the Netherlands. You could be having a conversation in New Delhi. You could be in Jakarta. That's how America is now globally perceived. And I'm afraid it's going to take a major change for that stance globally to be understood and accepted. So we've got a long, bumpy road ahead. I don't think China and America in Asia are the issue immediately. I think we've got more to come in the Caribbean, and my concern is the continuation of what's happening in terms of the Persian Gulf, but even more so, the unbelievable relationship with Israel, where Israel is inflicting the genocides the Third Reich inflicted upon its people, which drove the formation of that country in the first place. And Gaza is something that anyone who has any humanity, we are no better than those that tolerated the Holocaust to not speak out against what happens in Gaza. And yet this is core to American foreign policy. I'm more worried about those bonds for America than I am. I think China and America will grind up against each other. There'll be continued economic negative fallout from it. But a conflict, it could happen. It's not going to happen tomorrow, and there are more pressing points. 5 years from now, yeah, sure. 10 years from now, China and America could have a war on the Pacific. It is certainly on the cards, and I wouldn't rule it out.
But we are fine for now.
I think we're okay for now. Unless you're Cuban, I think that's a bit rough. That's interesting. What does one do to a little island nation just because its system is different than your own, and it never gave in to you, that you're allowed to, all these generations, keep it isolated, keep it backward, because it's so-called communist. There are people now suffering on the island of Cuba. One thing that is interesting, a Chinese cargo ship turned up 2 weeks ago, a massive boat full of medical supplies and food supplies, no military supplies. So it's giving humanitarian aid to Cuba because of what America's doing to it. And Marco Rubio is talking about invading it because he wants the votes of the and the support of the Cuban population in America. It's shameful. Why would you allow that bullying to take place? I don't really understand what threat Cuba is to the US, except it's not following its systems. You know, these are things, this is where I think we need to worry, because of the sort of Venezuelan situation is not always a one-off raid. It can actually turn into a nasty engagement. So, yeah, I think we have to be careful in terms of where we put the emphasis.
So, a lot of strong views, David, from Beijing, and you've painted a grim picture of American foreign policy. And you've said the summit will largely be forgotten, but it was nevertheless important. My final question to you is, many people can make a lot of arguments, accusations, and allegations against the Chinese too. The Chinese, whether it is Xinjiang, whether it is Tibet, whether it is many of the smaller countries on their periphery, and indeed India, where Indians, especially the Indian establishment, it has always tilted to America since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union as insurance against China. What do you say to that? And will this summit have any effect on that perception of China?
Big countries, all big countries, do bad things and clumsy things. India is an example. It does things internally which confound all that it purports to stand for. Doesn't change what it purports to stand for. China does clumsy things in Xinjiang. China has done clumsy things in Mongolia in respect of educating people that they speak Chinese and that they're able to be employed in the Chinese system, at the same time marginalizing their, in inverted commas, minority cultures. So there is a lot that China also, I think, needs to think about in the way it has discussed and handled the Taiwan issue. Far too much peevishness, belligerence, reaction. Be cool, demonstrate how stable you want this thing to be and starve out those things you don't like. Don't fight them all the time. And China has only just begun to get its Foreign Affairs Act together. All the time I have lived here, it has been rigid, doctrinaire in the way it talks about things. Very seldom has someone walked up like an Obama to a microphone and spoken with a kind of sense of spontaneity and you could think you're listening and relating to somebody. Chinese diplomats, leaders don't work that way. So probably Zhu Rongji was the premier under Jiang Zemin was a good example of someone that did and could. So there's a whole history here.
I admire him enormously. He's one of my favorite Chinese leaders and much underrated in the West.
Agreed. Yeah. So there's a lot that China needs to do better. Of course, that's true. But I would say, and I'm not saying in defense of China or to say, well, it can have a pretty rough and not necessarily effectual Xinjiang policy. But what I would say is that China, because it understands no matter what you do, unless you are hegemonic and truly imperial, you depend on a global system of norms, of laws, and forums that will facilitate trade and mitigate disputes. It has been one of the most compliant United Nations member for the last 25 years. You can look at the voting record, what it votes on. Other countries, bigger countries, America included, play fast and loose with the UN. They use it when they want it, they decry it and try and break it up when it gets in their way. China wants a global order. It is looking to try and restructure some form of this global rules-based order that was formed after 1945. And yes, it was to America and Europe's interest and Britain's interest. And yes, it was based around the institutions within those countries. But in many ways it worked, and it worked to everyone's benefit. And it prevented the sort of wars that perhaps now we're worried may become much larger than they are. So when I look at this summit, I see a country that wants to make sure we maintain globalization in a balanced manner, a country that wants the WTO to function again as it used to. So you can't just be random and arbitrary in your dealings with other countries on trade, creating greater facility for trade, a better economic and more stable environment. China wants the UN charters, the UN positions to be better respected and honoured. And we know that it hasn't always obeyed all of them itself. But I do make the point, by and large, it is compliant. So that is the dichotomy of Beijing. We have one political culture that's trying to disrupt it all because it feels constrained by it, America, out of weakness. China that's looking to make sure that if any way it can be reformed, and I would forecast we will see its reformation after this debacle in the Persian Gulf ends. And in the end, America will find a way to back off. I'm not saying when, whether we've got years ahead or there's a last minute kind of orgy of violence before it all ends. But I don't think China will step into the vacuum that will be left politically. because all those small states there won't want American bases again. China will want that political system to find its own equilibrium. They will rebuild and they will trade. And China is very transactional in that way. But it is not a country that's looking, as it once did, to export disruption of a global order that it felt dominated by or couldn't interact with. That's changed. So in a sense, I look at the two countries and I look at the things we can criticize China for. Let's not look to the virtue of a country. Very few nations have virtue. That's the domain of an individual. Countries are not people, like companies are not people. They have transactional needs. They have fundamental drivers that are pretty basic. So the nature of China's needs are it doesn't want to have to manage projected power, not because it's nicer than America and doesn't want it. It can't afford to manage it. It's too big. It can't disrupt its region in that way because of the economic considerations. So it wants a world order where it can be secure itself and trade along lines and within structures that are held and respected by others. That's the good thing about the future coming forward for China. In the American situation, I think eventually America will consolidate rather than embrace the sort of collapse of an empire. It'll consolidate around its huge economic prowess, hopefully restore its institutional prowess and integrity, and it'll be a great power for very many generations to come in a strange and not always easy equilibrium with China in a multipolar world. That's where I think we'll end up. But there could be a lot of disruption and even blood spilt along the way.
David Mahon, always a pleasure. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful day in Beijing. This is evening here in Washington, D.C. We are recording this on Monday, the 18th of May. Thank you very much for your time, David.
Thank you, Atul.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.